Today on Moment of Zen, we're bringing back a comprehensive conversation with Samo Burja about nuclear weapons and global energy geopolitics. This originally aired on Samo's show, Live Players, in 2024. Let's dive in.
Hey, Samo.
Hey, Erik.
How are you doing?
Pretty good.
Let's get right into it. I thought this week we would talk about energy. We briefly touched on it in our last episode, and maybe we could do a deep dive in this one, particularly around nuclear. How does that sound?
Okay, that sounds great.
Well, first, let's briefly touch on kind of the higher level. What do people not fully appreciate about how energy impacts geopolitics, or sort of the role of energy, or what misconceptions do people have? You mentioned yourself that one of the ways in which you changed your mind over the past few years was in this space. You've written a number of pieces, which we'll get into in Bismarck Brief, about how different countries have strengthened their, treated their nuclear development. Why don't you give a brief overview to kind of set the context for people who don't really know much about how energy impacts geopolitics, et cetera?
This is certainly a topic that has had numerous books devoted to it and innumerable policy papers. But if we zoom out to, the largest picture of history, starting with the Industrial Revolution, with the advent of coal, we became a fossil fuel powered civilization. Before this, the most useful resource was manpower, and sometimes, animal and water power. And these energy sources, while they're unevenly distributed around the world, it was basically just a function of arable land, right? The more arable land you had, the more population you had, the more donkeys, horses, cows, whatever you had, the more productive you were. This introduces the first geopolitical factor, which was easily accessible coal reserves. If you look at a map of World War I Europe, so this is about 100 years later after the start of the Industrial Revolution, you realize that they're basically fighting over the easily accessible coal fields of Europe. You can almost track area after area. And that's not a coincidence. Those were the areas that industrialized. In other words, coal is extremely regional as an energy source. It's like a particular province. It's like not all of Western Europe. It's like it's Belgium, right? Or it's not all of Britain. It's, maybe the North, and so on and so on. It's not a very easy to transport source of energy. It's basically a black rock that we burn. And actually, we burn it to this day. Coal, for now, remains the cheapest source of energy. We now convert it, of course, to electricity. The second stage, historically, is oil. Oil is much more useful for mobile vehicles, hence its importance during World War II. During World War II, an oil shortage could cripple warfighting. This wouldn't have been the case during the First World War. This means, again, if you look at the map of World War II, you can see that at least some major decisions are made with oil fields in mind, such as denying the oil fields of Romania to the Germans, denying sources of oil to the Japanese. There was the oil embargo before World War II even got started. Oil is a globalized source of energy. It's not a black stone. It's not a black rock that we burn. It's a liquid. You can transport a liquid very easily through oil pipelines and through tankers. Ships, to this day, are the cheapest way we have to ship large quantities of goods. And if you basically just pump a ship full of this black liquid, you can sail it anywhere around the world. Were it not for geopolitics, I think, oil would be a real globalized market. Coal, not so much. You still have to, it's still kind of expensive to fill a ship with coal and sail it to the other part of the world. People kind of do it now in a hyper-globalized world, but you still have an energy advantage to this day if you're burning coal right next to where you're mining it. It's just better physics. But oil is not evenly distributed around the world. And this leads us to the sort of post-World War II era, the era of, the Russians, the Soviet Union, perhaps not being super economically efficient, but pumping out, a lot of fossil fuels, as they still do to this day as the Russian Federation. One of the results of this was that the US cultivated other allies around the world that had cheap and easily accessible oil. So a small desert country or a large desert country suddenly has global impact because everyone's consuming their oil, driving their cars, producing various plastics. The whole industrial economy of the Cold War, runs on oil. And when the oil stopped flowing, the engine sputters, which happened in the 1970s with the oil shocks. So, countries such as Saudi Arabia, but also countries such as formerly Persia, now Iran, after the Islamic Revolution, had immense leverage. The most recent energy revolution related to the fossil fuel stack, which I'm describing because to talk about nuclear, we have to talk about the alternative stack, right? And our current stack is a fossil fuel stack, was the fracking revolution. The key thing that changed here is while the US was always a producer of oil, right? In fact, Texas was one of the first places where, oil exploitation really took off. There were Texas oilmen traveling the Soviet Union actually in the 1920s and 30s, seeking business opportunities to set up Soviet oil production. Yes, the Soviets contracted with US experts to set up their oil industry. And if you look at Saudi Arabia, of course, Saudi Aramco used to be the Arab American oil company. It is since, it is since owned by the Saudis. However, if you work in this industry, so many Americans who to this day live and work in Saudi Arabia in these basically company towns and are still attached to the oil sector. It's incredible, right? Decades upon decades, and this tradition of knowledge is still tied to the U.S. and the U.S. sector. And fracking is the key technology here that changes global energy geopolitics in the early 2000s, just as the war on terror is taking off, just as the Middle East appears to be perpetually the destiny of the United States to be trapped in quagmire after quagmire there. Fracking changes the situation because it's only legal in the United States. Britain could frack, actually. Britain could become energy independent. They just basically don't want it. There's some real environmentalist concerns, but I think this is just NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. No one really wants an oil well, let alone fracking near where they live. So in a funny way, this leads me to the last sort of thought on global energy geopolitics. Fracking deconstrains at least access to light oil. You still have to mix it with heavier oil to get, efficient refining and so on. However, low population density countries have an advantage when it comes to mining. Think of what the top resource exporters when it comes to minerals and fossil fuels and all of this are. What kind of countries are these? Well, it's Russia, it's Australia, it's Canada, it's, slowly maybe Brazil, though Brazil's more agricultural. It's, Saudi Arabia, it's the United States. Half of the United States is basically desert and mountains. There are resources beneath the surface of the earth, huge amounts of these resources. We continue to discover them and access them with new technology. But as soon as an area is densely inhabited and populated, almost no matter what your political system is, there is local concentrated opposition to mining operations. The only exception is when the town only exists because of mining. Then the locals are in favor of keeping the mine going. But if there's already a town there will be strong local opposition to opening a mine or pumping oil or doing anything else. So this means large countries, because they have more land area, will probabilistically in the future discover more resources of all kinds, including stuff like, we could talk about rare earth metals, but they're not even that rare anymore, and they never were. And low population densities help you not have local opposition, right? People in Moscow, totally fine with drilling and digging in Siberia. People in most parts of the US, but not all, totally okay with North Dakota South Dakota and all of that being fracked up. Like, that's okay. So let's talk now about nuclear. Nuclear enters the story in 1945 with the dropping, actually with the Trinity test, the first atomic explosion. There was a physics possibility of exploiting nuclear reactions for energy that scientists and science fiction authors had actually written about in the 1930s. I really recommend people read, various 1930s science fiction books. There's a particular Swedish science fiction author, Olaf Stapledon. He died in 1950. So, this is a very interesting example of basically a 19th century man writing about, Kardashev scale civilizations, basically. Very much recommend his work and his thoughts. But still, he wasn't unique. So there were people foreseeing an energy transition from chemistry-based energy, which basically includes fossil fuels as such, to, basically atomic scale reactions to physics-based energy. The nuclear, the bomb basically scared everyone. At first, it was just like, wow, the industrialized war of World War II, there's going to be a repeat. There's going to be another terrible industrialized war with thousands of planes flying. And we're going to be annihilating whole cities, just as, was done with Tokyo fire bombings or Dresden, or the way, Leningrad and Stalingrad got completely destroyed by the fighting between the Red Army and the German forces. And it dawned slowly as you go into the 1960s that, wait, actually, the rockets are so good, we don't need planes anymore. Not for delivering nukes. Wait, the nukes can fly anywhere in the world in under an hour. Wait, you can wire them all up together. And then this sheer almost existential terror comes into view, where we've created a massive doomsday machine. A doomsday machine with thousands of pieces, right? All of them can go wrong, with humans in the loop. But in theory, in the popular imagination enters the president with the power to press a button and end the world. Now, you might ask, which president? It's that's obvious. It's the US president. So to this day, I think in the national American mythology, the nuclear football is this almost supernatural power that is bestowed upon the US president, as if you might bestow the crown jewels or a papal charisma. And, the Soviet premier had a little bit of this, but never had PR. He was sort of the Manichaean evil counterpart to the US president. Now, of course, if the US president was evil, then, the theology all breaks. And this also made it so much more important to pick the president. And why is this still so important to emphasize? Because I think the most fundamental barrier to the adoption of nuclear energy actually remains proliferation. We could have orders of magnitude more energy consumption with scaling nuclear reactors. Building a single machine in an industrial civilization is always extremely expensive. Building 1,000 is much cheaper. Any capital expenditure you have for specialized tools, for example, if you want to make a giant steel dome for a nuclear reactor, right? You build one, that's a really expensive steel dome. You build 1,000, okay, the cost per unit is probably under a third, under a quarter, maybe even under 10%, depending on the details of how you're doing that steel construction and how you're shipping it to where the reactor ultimately stands. Every single part of a complicated machine like a nuclear reactor is a product of industrial society, and industrial societies are societies of scale. If we were to provide all the energy that we use for fossil fuels, it would be at most 1,000 or so large nuclear reactors. And that's not that many products, right? That's not that many units. For us to really reap the benefits of the economies of scale of nuclear energy, We would need tens of thousands of reactors. But here we hit onto the real problem. I think nuclear reactors do subsidize and facilitate the transfer of the kind of technical expertise that are needed to make an atomic bomb. It is a quirk of physics, but I think a real one, that honestly, if you have the enriched material like uranium or plutonium, it's like actually not that hard to make a bomb. Look, North Korea can do it. For real, let's think about this. North Korea can build a bomb. North Korea is a super isolated country, right? It's a super sanctioned country. It's not particularly resource-rich country. So then if the default way to have energy is universal, cheap and abundant nuclear reactors, I think the great powers of the world have the problem that suddenly the small countries are on an equal footing. I reject the premise, perhaps controversially, that nuclear proliferation increases the odds of Armageddon. I actually think that, if Estonia or Slovenia, or for that matter, even South Korea, have, a dozen nuclear warheads, I think they would basically just use them in self-defense. And yes, a dozen nuclear warheads is enough to prevent even a major country like the United States or China from invading you. But maybe that's a good thing. However, the great powers of the world, in fact, do want to limit nuclear proliferation. I just feel like at this point, it's better to think of it in terms of like arms control between the countries that have the truly huge stockpiles that could end the world, rather than trying to put the genie back into the bottle. And it's been 80 years, right? This is technology from 1945. Uranium is, it's tricky. It's like not every country has uranium, but it's not that hard to source it. Like say Kazakhstan exports uranium, Australia exports uranium. And as I outlined earlier, what I was saying implicitly about the still significant abundance of fossil fuels, that's even more true of uranium. I think you can take almost any piece of like land around the world, and if you dug deep enough, eventually you run into all sorts of metals, including uranium. Now, our technology is not yet advanced enough to go, drill boreholes into the Earth's crust and mantle, but eventually it will be, right? So eventually, assuming technological progress, uranium is widely accessible, it's easy to enrich, it's easy to build. So I think we have to grapple with a security architecture where basically every sovereign country either has nuclear weapons or has the ability to get them. And until we sort of are at that point, we're in this weird transition phase where nuclear exports are super controlled. Like I said, the only way to make nuclear energy affordable is to vastly scale how many reactors of a certain type you build. And to vastly scale that, right? To vastly scale that, if you're a small country, again, like South Korea, if you want to build 12 nuclear reactors instead of 12 warheads, that's a pricey undertaking for South Korea. But were South Korea to succeed in exporting 50 or 100 reactors, then a national nuclear industry and building those reactors is affordable. For South Korea to export those, they have to deal with the United States, where the US is perhaps going to be quite sensibly, you can't export to Iran. And there's good reasons not to export to Iran, like at least now when we're in the area where proliferation has not completed. I sketched out earlier why I think proliferation is inevitable on the long run, but right now it's not yet completed. So enabling this or that country to go through what I call the nuclear transition, because I do think it's inevitable assuming technical civilization continues, you might choose to slow this or that country down. But, even say a country like Russia that's perhaps at times happy to export nuclear technology to Eastern Europe might think twice if, say, Poland was to start building a nuclear reactor as to whether they want to export even more tech there, right? Because, they have this deep geopolitical conflict. So the large countries do want to prevent the small countries and the weaker powers, the middle powers. The great powers want to prevent the middle powers from basically exporting nuclear reactors. Occasionally, a country like France kind of ignores the US, right? And just exports anyway, even though it's an ally. The great countries have a fundamental problem of over-regulation and bureaucratization. So China might as well be a planet. It's 1.3 billion people, vast geography, half of it is desert or mountain. The US, again, might as well be a planet. 300 million people doesn't quite sound like a planet, but it basically is a planet's worth of people if we were, living in 1800, right? And its population is still growing due to immigration and demographic momentum. I think the US, China, and possibly if they got their act together, the European Union have a large enough internal market that if they could have a thriving nuclear industry building a few hundred nuclear reactors, I think this would result in an energy mix of about 30% or so electricity powered by nuclear. But to get to the real energy revolution, to get to the energy revolution of 100% nuclear or 90% or 80% nuclear, I think for that you would have to build not hundreds of reactors, but thousands or tens of thousands. And there we start hitting onto problems of scale. We are fundamentally still an unserious civilization, burning black rocks and black liquid for our energy. Our energy needs are kind of trivial. We drive around a little bit. We melt metals. I'm almost running out of what else is expensive, really. Like we drive around vehicles to do work. We have factories that have like automated machinery, and we melt metals. Kind of, our needs aren't that high. We would need to spend an order of magnitude more energy, or 2 orders of magnitude more energy. And if we did that, then I think nuclear at scale would be vastly cheaper than coal. So when they promised us energy too cheap to meter in the 1950s, they were imagining a world of two things. They were imagining a world where the long-term historical trend of energy consumption that was exponential at the time would continue, and that we would be spending 5 or 10 times more energy than we are today. And number two, they thought that the proliferation would either be solved or we would all go extinct. Proliferation is not solved. The nuclear world order is not yet developed. But, we're not dead, fortunately. And there's not been a civilization-wrecking nuclear war. And, we can be grateful for that. And I think we should continue being very careful with the international politics. But I do think that there's a kind of moment where this overgrown kid is still living in their mom's basement. We should be a nuclear civilization by now. We chose not to be because we don't have an ambition big enough to need nuclear.
That's well articulated.
I've been thinking about this very deeply for a very long time, as you can tell. I've written like 10 briefs on it.
Totally. I read all of them.
You nerd sniped me with your first question this episode.
Yeah, it's great.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 41,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days and not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/Zen. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/Zen. netsuite.com/Zen. So it's a new year, 2025. And one of the recurring questions I've already been receiving is, should I start my own business? Can I do it all on my own? Now more than ever, my answer is a resounding yes. with tools like today's sponsor, Shopify. It's never been easier to start pursuing your dreams. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. No coding or design skills required. They also help with the details like shipping, taxes, payments, and have social media tools that connect all your channels and create shoppable posts, allowing you to focus on the important stuff, like growing your business. What happens if you don't act now? Will you regret it? What if someone beats you to the idea? Don't kick yourself when you hear this again in a year because you didn't do anything now. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/momentofzen, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/momentofzen to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/momentofzen.
So are you basically making an accelerationist argument that, hey, this is inevitable, and so we should accelerate it because it's going to happen and because there are some good things that come with it, and yeah, there are some risks that come with it, but it is inevitable, and thus we should do it sooner? Do you see yourself making an accelerationist argument, and what do you say to someone who says, is it inevitable? Why are you have so much conviction that it's inevitable?
Okay, that's a very good question. In their Twitter handle, EAC, Lambda ACK, UAC, whatever. So I'm happy to coin nuclear acceleration and ACK. It's like atom punk, whatever you want to call it. It's like, sure, I'm not saying our hair won't get singed, 20 to 30 million dead tops, but, after a small nuclear war here or there, we'll have abundant energy for all. No, and you don't want to be flippant about it, right? War is like absolutely terrible, but like actually imagine if we stopped the development of dynamite to prevent World War I. Like, doesn't actually quite make sense. The argument used by like physicists in the 30s and 40s, because some of them were also, kind of Marxist and all of them were idealists, right? Was that a nuclear scale civilization has to be a world civilization. But I could see some forces in nuclear actually going the other way. In a way, maybe nuclear weapons are the Second Amendment of the international community. Maybe every sovereign country should have some nukes. If every sovereign country has some nukes, well, maybe this makes conventional war kind of expensive, kind of risky. But since it's just a small country and only has a few nukes, the occasional war that happens doesn't end the world. And the automated systems of the great doomsday machines of the former Soviet Union and the United States that were honestly wired to, in case there's a nuclear strike, the default war plan called for nuking sometimes even totally unrelated opponents. Say the US had, if it is in a nuclear war with Russia, also nuke China. Like that was just an official war plan, which kind of makes grim geopolitical sense, because if the Russia and the US nuke each other, like who wins? China. If China and Russia nuke each other, who wins? Well, America. So, okay, the Russians were also like, if we get into a nuclear war with China, nuke America also. But I think that only really happens if the big powers have their vast nuclear arsenals and no one else has them. I don't think nuclear weapons are good, but I think eventually, after a turbulent period, yes, all the small countries will be capable of building nuclear weapons within a year. Japan is capable of building nuclear weapons in less than a year. They stockpile many tons of plutonium. This, by the way, is with the approval of the United States. So that's an interesting case where the US doesn't want a nuclear-armed Japan, but the US actually chastised the Japanese government when, in the aftermath of the Fukushima accident, they closed down their nuclear reactors, and the future of this plutonium that's stockpiled for research purposes, right? Civilian energy research purposes. There's no use for it other than nuclear weapons. There's like a hypothetical reactor system they were going to build that they never built, but they're still stockpiling tons of the stuff, literal tons. The US was concerned that Japan would stop having a stockpile of plutonium. Like, think about that. They couldn't quite say it. Let's remember, Japan has a pacifist constitution. One of the largest navies in the world is just a, self-defense force, a glorified Coast Guard. Their military is also a self-defense force. It's not an army. Their air force is a self-defense, et cetera, right? The Constitution has a line that it's illegal to call or declare war as Japan, aggressively. So the U.S. Understands that Japan has all the parts in front of it to build a nuclear arsenal within a year if the geopolitics changes. It has the Japanese Space Agency, which means that they have ICBMs. They can build rockets. They have the know-how. They actually build very, very good rockets. Like, they basically were the main partner for the UAE Mars mission. So Japan has like space technology to the point of being able to take payloads all the way to Mars. They certainly have what it takes to bring a payload to Beijing, or Pyongyang for that matter. And they also have this large stockpile of plutonium. And in recent years, they've revived their nuclear industry. They also just need it for energy. Japan is a very densely populated country. So they have been dependent on fossil fuel imports. Nuclear alleviates this. They buy a lot of liquefied natural gas. Gas is interesting. It's sort of, I would say, geopolitically between coal, which is super local, regional, and oil, which is global. I think it's like a continental scale resource. Gas is hard to liquefy. It's expensive to liquefy and put on a boat, but it's not expensive to put into a pipeline. So gas pipelines are the reason why, say, Russia's energy policy matters so much more for Europe than it does for America. But say Russia's oil policy, oil exports, whatever, impact Europe and America about the same. So that's the difference between, natural gas and oil, roughly speaking, simplifying. And to go just a step back, Japan has to buy the, liquefied natural gas. It has to buy all of these other things. Nuclear reactors are something where they can lean into their domestic advantage of highly advanced industry, highly trained technical talent to provide them with relatively reliable energy. I'll return to Japan a little bit later to talk about Fukushima, but nuclear accelerationism would suggest that there's not a problem with Japan having nuclear weapons 1 year away. If it's a peaceful neighborhood, the weapons aren't assembled. There's no risk of a nuclear accident, no risk of a Dr. Strangelove scenario where a crazed military officer, perhaps wanting to restore the glory of the emperor unilaterally, decides to nuke China to initiate national rebirth of Japan. You think I'm kidding, but there are people who will think like this. This is not, there are even fringe Shinto worshipping hardline elements in the Japanese government to this day. Japanese ultranationalism is a fun Wikipedia rabbit hole if you ever want to go down into it. And it also minimizes the odds of technical error, right, of accidental launch or accidental detonation. Have you ever heard of what the U.S. Air Force refers to as broken arrow?
No, I've never heard of it.
Okay. Broken arrow is a nuclear weapon accident. It's defined as an unexpected event involving nuclear weapons that results in the accidental launching, firing, detonation, theft, or loss of the weapon. The U.S. has actually lost several nukes. There are 32 known broken arrow incidents that have been documented. And to this day, I think that there's a plane crash where 2 nukes just got lost somewhere. I think it's somewhere in Pennsylvania or something like this. So to this day, a lucky treasure hunter might find a nuke somewhere where the U.S. military failed to. But joking aside, technical problems and then politically disloyal elements starting a war, even when it's not in the national interest. And then, of course, you have in the Cold War era, people more thought about a rogue military element. And in the 2000s, they more thought about the terrorism scenario where there's just theft and the terrorists were to use a nuclear weapon, right? That was kind of the fear factor behind a lot of the stuff that happened post 9/11 all the way until the early 2010s, because the assumption was, hey, Maybe they're going to try to get a nuke from a rogue regime like Libya or Iraq or even North Korea, and then we're really screwed. So those two are alleviated by having a nuclear-ready country. A correct analog to this, I think, would be, imagine that it's legal to have a disassembled gun in your home. Like, imagine a country where you had most people don't own guns, but it's legal to have a disassembled gun. This is not a protection against immediate home invasion, but it is a protection of sorts, right? It is a protection for all sorts of contingencies, a civil war or government tyranny, or maybe you decide, hey, my neighborhood is becoming much more unsafe. I don't care that it's illegal, and you just assemble it and then you have it. So it's potentially there, even if it's not officially there. By the way, that's basically Israel's situation. Israel is officially neither confirms nor denies to having nuclear weapons. And because it neither confirms nor denies, the US mostly doesn't give it a hard time, even though it's in violation of various non-proliferation guidelines. Again, for US interests in particular, it's kind of fine that Israel has nuclear weapons, but it's kind of not fine that they acknowledge that they have nuclear weapons. I think war will still happen. And I think, unfortunately, in this world, nuclear weapons will be used. Say in the recent Armenian versus Azerbaijan conflict, these are two tiny countries, right? In a nuclear world, I think they would have it. They would have a bomb. They probably wouldn't use them because they're so small. But the nuclear weapon means that you're punching each other out, and then one of them is like, back off, or I'm pulling out a knife. I think there would be a lot of negotiated peace as well. There wouldn't just be crazed off small countries nuking each other over petty wars. I think they'd be a lot of, okay, we fight a war, we lost 5% of our territory, you get these concessions, but no further. And then the other person's like, okay, just kidding, bro. Okay, right? Because again, a small country maybe has one big city, and you can't take that much of a beating until you just cease to exist. So why do I think it's inevitable, though? That's a good question. And I think it's just the technology is the worst it will ever be. And we're nowhere near the physical limits of it.
Yeah. But would that same thinking or the same argument for nuclear accelerationism also make you an accelerationist across the board?
No.
What would not make you an accelerationist when it comes to AI or something else? Like, what's an argument that would work there, but that wouldn't also apply for nuclear? Like, where is it different?
Well, okay, first off, let me say I am opposed to the expansion of the US, Russian, or Chinese nuclear arsenal. So the number of nuclear warheads. I'm not opposed to Poland having 5 tons of plutonium that they stockpile just in case NATO dissolves and they decide that they need nuclear weapons to defend themselves against Russia, right? I'm not even opposed to Belarus having a stockpile of plutonium. They probably do, honestly. I would have to look into it in case, Russia becomes a democracy and they truly become the North Korea of Europe, right? The Belarusian regime under Lukashenko. I would say that the US is already paying the full price of building a vast nuclear arsenal. It might as well reap the benefits from building cheap and abundant nuclear energy. Like we already have thousands of nukes. Nothing you or I could do will ever convince the US government to not have thousands of nukes. But maybe we can have lots of cheap nuclear energy here. So it's sort of, in the ideal world, I think we wouldn't have nuclear weapons. Maybe we wouldn't have weapons at all. And we certainly, in an achievable world, would not have this idea that the point of nuclear weapons is to stockpile for a doomsday machine. It would just be a high energy explosive to be used proportionally. And as bizarre as this sounds, US strategists following game theory, they were so entranced by the beautiful mathematics of game theory. They thought they could quantify all of these interesting risks. Even some of the scientists were so confident, they're like, even aliens will use game theory to think about things like mutually assured destruction. Yet we now know from Russian documents in the 1960s, they didn't use game theory at all. As late as 1960, they were using normal military doctrine for the development of their nuclear weapons program. So you think you're going to meet aliens and there's going to be this mutual assured destruction argument that you're going to take out your math and calculate the odds. Look, if the Russians don't think that way, why would people from another star system? Why would an AI? I think there's this hubris that we want to have these very simple quantifiable games. And there's something about game theory where it's really good and easy to model, like zero sum and negative sum stuff. But the positive sum stuff is harder to model. So if you're using these tools, they almost distort you kind of to think in the more zero sum world, right? Where one side's loss is another side's win and vice versa. And in that world, if there are 5 million Russians after the war, but 50 million Americans, then America won, right? That's in the zero sum logic. It's not quite the true logic of life. And it's not even the true logic of most war, I would say. So this is perhaps an interesting disagreement one could have, or dig into the work of Clausewitz, or trace some of these later Western military thinkers and contrast them with, say, Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu proposed that the best form of war fighting is to not fight a war at all.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Every time I hop on the 101 freeway in SF, I look up at the various tech billboards and think, damn, turpentine should definitely be up there. And I bet I'm not alone. In a world of endless scrolling and ad blockers, sometimes the most powerful way to reach people is in the real world. That's where AdQuick comes in. The easiest way to book out-of-home ads, like billboards, vehicle wraps, and airport displays. The same way you would order an Uber. Started by Instacart alums, AdQuick was born from their own personal struggles to book and measure ad success. AdQuick's audience targeting, campaign management, and analytics bring the precision and efficiency of digital to the real world. Ready to get your brand the attention it deserves? Visit adquick.com today to start reaching your customers in the real world. Again, that's adquick.com. Hey everyone, Erik here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lenihan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript and React and Next.js ready to onboard to your team today. For backend, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention turpentine to skip the waitlist.
How would Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Palestine be different if your world had come to pass earlier?
That's a very good question. I think the development of Israel-Palestine would have been completely different. The complicated history there. I will note that it's such a small strip of land. There's no way for even Israel to use a nuclear weapon against Gaza. Gaza, I could see some super extremist government in Hamas using a nuclear weapon against Israel and not caring if there are parts of Gaza that are damaged. However, in that world, the Israeli government would have already, it would have, and maybe this is not a great outcome, depending on who you ask. For other people, it's a great outcome. I think the government would have been okay, this is an unacceptable risk. It's kind of terrible. We don't, it's expensive, it's dangerous, but I think we just have to govern Gaza. Because if we don't govern Gaza, we can't secure the one nuclear reactor that Gaza has. And if we can't secure the one nuclear reactor Gaza has, or the two, or how many any power the city, it might be appropriate, it might be used for a nuclear weapon. So I think basically in that situation, like Israel's still in a bad position, but it would have deployed its other conventional means to prevent an extremist group from controlling territory or controlling facilities that are nuclear facilities. So in a way, the US does this on a global scale today, right? Sometimes truthfully and sometimes it lies, right? It lied about there being weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2004. But, in principle, it was like, okay, we have to bomb this or that facility, right? I do think the more you push it towards atom punk, the harder it gets to control. But I think that since it's such a blunt weapon, it's very difficult to have like small nuclear explosives. I think the activation cost to using it is pretty high. And this actually means that it's going to be used very infrequently. If you judge nuclear weapons not as a world-ending terror or status symbol, but merely as a tool in warfighting, it's actually a kind of shitty tool. It would actually be very hard for Russia to use nuclear weapons in a way that moves the Russia-Ukraine front. Like, it requires immense concentration of military force, right? Like, you would need to have like lots of tanks and vehicles or lots of personnel, and then you drop maybe a 5 kiloton weapon, like on the smaller end, right? We to this day, again, having talked about dynamite, to this day, we tend to measure the explosive power of nuclear weapons in thousands kilotons or megatons, so millions of tons of TNT. So if you pile up 1 million tons of TNT and you blow it up, that's 1 megaton explosion, and that's like a solid-sized nuclear weapon. But what would this do? Like, if we lived in the world where, Russia and Ukraine were dropping tactical nuclear weapons, right? I think in that world, you would see much more dispersal of equipment. First off, I think artillery becomes less useful. What is artillery? You bring a bunch of cannons somewhere and you concentrate fire onto a particular part of the battlefield. And your artillery usually has to be pretty close together to get like a solid amount of shelling going. With nuclear artillery, basically. By the way, the U.S. military was developing this sort of tactical weapon stuff in the 60s and so on. There's like a nuclear cannon. If you want, you can go on YouTube and Google U.S. military nuclear cannon, and you see this surreal thing of like a gun shooting, and then like you wait, and then a nuclear explosion there. Like, a cannon's not the right delivery vehicle for an atomic bomb, but they sure did try. They sure did try to fit it into their military technology of the time. And I think the result is much greater dispersal of forces. I think if the Russians unilaterally started the war by just genociding the Ukrainians, by not destroying their military, but their population, there would be such an outcry around the world, and everyone would basically consider them not just dangerous, but like absolutely mad dogs, basically. I think Russia would have an extremely bad time. And I could even see the United States issuing an ultimatum, right? So note, though, that I think is not a fact about the nuclear weapons themselves. I think this is more a fact about if you went ahead and did something extreme with them. So I'm hopeful, just probabilistically, I don't think, unfortunately, we can avoid it, that the first time a nuclear weapon is used is in a small war. And this causes us, in the gravity of that terrible event, when it happens, when perhaps a city is destroyed, or maybe if we're a bit luckier, like, I don't know, an Air Force, an aircraft carrier task group maybe gets destroyed off the coast of Taiwan. Everyone's like, whoa. They think about it and they decide, actually, while we don't want to use nukes, we also, just because a nuke detonated, we're not going to automatically escalate. We're not going to do this game theory thing of 60 minutes to end the world. And I think that's really an institutional reform and a policy thinking reform that has to happen with the great powers themselves because only Russia, the United States, and in the near future, probably China, have thousands of nuclear weapons. Other countries, even larger arsenals like that of, Britain or France, we're talking hundreds. And if we're talking Pakistan and India, we're talking dozens, maybe now slowly going into the hundreds.
Is it fair to crudely summarize your position as, hey, the only way we get the abundance that comes with nuclear is also to increase the risk of nuclear war, which is to say, is to allow the exporting to countries that we may not want it, like Iran and North Korea? Is that accurate, or how would you edit that?
I could state it. I could state it differently, because I think this is something that provokes strong feelings with good reason, and I'm hoping that with this podcast we will never shy away from controversial topics, and hopefully the sponsors agree. I mean, hopefully. No, I think it's more the case that even if we don't get abundant energy, the national security argument for getting nuclear weapons is so overwhelming, and whilst is so overwhelming that many countries will pursue acquiring nuclear weapons even without acquiring like cheap nuclear power. Again, for North Korea, I guarantee you they have an easier time making 6 nuclear weapons that work than creating the conditions for energy abundance for North Koreans. Like, look, they still have a communist-ish ideology, like a communist nationalist ideology. They would be so thrilled. They'd be like, look at us, like we have achieved energy abundance while the capitalist pigs haven't. But they don't have the scale. They don't have the resources. They don't have the technical expertise. We're a bit unlucky that it's easier industrially to make a bomb than it is to make lots of cheap nuclear reactors, okay? And countries will pursue acquiring nuclear weapons. Maybe if there is regime change in North Korea one day, this country will lose nuclear weapons, right? But I guarantee you that if they say merge with South Korea is still going to have lots of plutonium. So it's still going to be 1 year away in perpetuity for developing nuclear weapons. And all of these countries will, even if very poor and unstable, will pursue nuclear weapons for safety. The US actually contributes to this. It's inevitable in the big picture, but the US accelerated this by, say, promising Gaddafi that if he stops his nuclear weapons program and his weapons of mass destruction programs, he's not going to have the same fate as Saddam Hussein. That's true. He had a worse fate. Okay, Saddam Hussein had a trial. Saddam Hussein's supporters, which I am not, would say it's a show trial. And Gaddafi got kind of butchered in the streets on video. That video of Gaddafi, this terrible, evil tyrant, still being, killed in the streets. From what I hear, there's an unconfirmed source that says Vladimir Putin watched that video over and over again for a week. So, we might hope that, that clearly that will calm him down, right? That'll cause him to be afraid. It did cause him to be afraid, but I think maybe that backfired in an important way. Maybe he was like, okay, no matter what, I have to understand that if I lose power, I die. Okay? And the same was thought in the North Korean leadership. That's why the Kim dynasty, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, they understand that there's no happy exit for them as the dictators. They didn't even set up the system. Kim Jong-un is just born into it. Imagine you wake up this morning and you're a liberal Democrat Kim Jong-un. Do you just decide that, you know what, I'm just going to die painfully? And you immediately disassemble your system. Even if you're like, oh, I'm going to go defect somewhere to safety. Who in the world is going to offer you safety? Even Switzerland's not going to do that. Russia's not going to do that. Russia needs you there. America is not to be trusted, okay? They'll put you on trial and they will kill you, right? Or they'll hand you back to the South Korean government or the new North Korean government, and they're going to kill you.
So there's no end game.
There's no end game, and you were just born into this. Absolutely terrible. He has my empathy, but also, he is still culpable for, any sort of tyrannical actions he undertakes, but it's a really legitimately bad situation to be born into. Comfy perhaps, but I think a barbed wire gilded cage would be a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
or a gilded throne that's also your execution chair. Wow,
So
this is getting. I'll make it a bit lighter. Okay, again, all of these petty tyrants around the world, and all of these, even democratic countries like Israel, have an overwhelming local national security incentive to acquire nuclear weapons. Once a country acquires nuclear weapons, it is very unlikely it'll get rid of nuclear weapons. Of the countries that denuclearized, South Africa is the only true example, in my opinion, where there was a peaceful and orderly handover of power from the apartheid regime to the sort of post-apartheid regime. And in that transition, the apartheid regime itself decided, we don't want our successors to have nuclear weapons. And South Africa disassembled its nuclear weapons. For Ukraine, the handover was, Ukraine was denuclearized with the fall of the Soviet Union, but the weapons were technologically controlled by Russia. So it's sort of like they could have kept radioactive pieces of metal, which might have been useful and could have been reprocessed into working nuclear weapons. But the safeties on the Soviet nuclear weapons in Ukraine were such that you couldn't just use them off the shelf. So denuclearization is rare. Nuclearization is easy and becoming easier. Countries, once they nuclearize, do not denuclearize. I think it's a ratchet. I think we have a nuclear proliferation ratchet. And as it ratchets up, we are paying the security and humanitarian cost of nuclear weapons step by step, year by year, perhaps inevitably, right? Maybe it's going to take 200 years. Maybe it's going to take 50 years. But eventually, I think most of the planet will have nuclear capability. We might just not have abundant energy. So I would say there is a nuclear weapons ratchet already. Let us accelerate the civilian technology that is more difficult on top of the nuclear ratchet. We can do other things to try to denuclearize, but controlling the technology has failed. North Korea can do it. The only way to prevent the world from nuclearizing like North Korea has is to prevent the world from industrializing, which we're not willing to do. I don't think we're willing to keep Latin America and Africa and the middle and parts of the Middle East without oil in perpetual poverty forever. So it means eventually, they get their guns, they get their trucks, they get their factories, they get their mines, they get their coal power plants. And yes, they will eventually get their nuclear weapons, just as North Korea has. You can be very poor, but as long as you're industrialized, you can do it.
So you're saying, hey, it's inevitable to get nuclear weapons. We might as well accelerate it in a way that also leads to more energy, or it might as well make sure get some energy, get some positives out of it.
I think we should build as many nuclear reactors as possible in all the countries that already have nuclear weapons. And for the countries that do not have nuclear weapons, I think a fair deal is that they get to buy their neighbors' electricity. And except for Latin America and Africa, every part of the world has plenty of countries that already have nuclear weapons. So I don't know. Europeans might not like it, but if France were to build 1,000 nuclear reactors, this does nothing to increase the world-ending risk of France, right? France is not an existential risk. There's no Napoleon, there's no thousands of nuclear weapons ready. And if they build 1,000 nuclear reactors, that's not going to in any way automatically make them build 1,000 nuclear weapons. It actually might reduce the risk. It might be, we have such cheap energy. We're selling energy to Germany, to Spain, to Britain across the channel. We just build a high voltage line under the sea. This stuff would, I think this stuff would actually work for most industrialized parts of the world. And for Japan, look, they already have 5 tons of plutonium. They're not, unless their security situation gets worse, increase that to a stockpile of 5 tons. Picking a random example, they have more than that, but they're not going to increase their stockpile of plutonium by 100-fold just because they increase their energy consumption and production 100-fold. They might do that anyway, even without cheap energy, if they judge the United States will not back them in case of a Chinese invasion. So they decide, actually, our long-term security bet is going to be having a nuclear arsenal that matches China's, right? That could happen, but that's total security logic. It doesn't have anything to do with reactors. So I'm in favor of free export of nuclear technology between all countries that already have nuclear weapons. And perhaps you could even be kind of nice and be like, hey, if you don't acquire nuclear weapons, the nuclear the nuclear club offers you cheap electricity prices and exports, and we're actually going to subsidize your energy usage. Here's a crazy and fun one. Maybe the US should offer cheap fossil fuels to any country that's chooses to not have nuclear technology.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a fun one. We should wrap on that because we're at the hour. But I'm glad we did a broad overview on this topic, because it's a topic we'll continue to go deeper on in episodes to come. You have some great posts on Bismarck Brief that I highly recommend people reading on Russia and South Korea and Japan and fracking. We've hinted at a few of them. We'll go deeper in future episodes. Samo, always a pleasure. Excited for next week.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, Erik.
Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors.